Well, welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is 13 August 2026 years after Jesus. Thanks for joining me in the backyard of my common sense epistemology mentor, Dr. Doug Guyvett. His pen name is R. Douglas Guyvett. R. Douglas Guyvett. He's written books like Evil and the Evidence for God. He's co-edited with Brendan Sweetman a 1992 Oxford Press volume called Contemporary Perspectives in Religious Epistemology, which was my text in religious epistemology, common sense approach, when I took it back in the day. And we're in the backyard. As I said, this is not my backyard, it's my common sense epistemology mentor, Dr. Doug Guyvett's backyard. And we're continuing on with this wonderful volume called The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. America since the 60s. Guys, this is fantastic. Get a physical copy today. Get it. Get a physical copy and have it on your bookshelf. Follow along. We're in the section on war. We were talking about Vietnam. Viet effing Nam, man. And the last episode we did on this topic was May 14th, 2026 years after Jesus. Jeez. Has it been that long, really? That was a Thursday. And it seems like that Thursday I had a cigar with another TRP guest, Dr. David Horner, professor at Biola University. Yeah, he came on the podcast. Dr. David Horner. And we had cigars for 6 hours that night, right after that last episode. Maybe I'll tell you about that conversation that we had for 6 hours on church administration at some point. I would love to fill you in on church administration in Orange County. But you're not interested in that. You're tuned in because you want to hear about Christopher Caldwell and what he says about the Vietnam War generation and class, starting at page 74 in this volume. We're going to do a fair use, make a transformative reading of Christopher Caldwell's The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. Thank you, Chris, for writing this. He's one of my favorite authors on contemporary American politics. Thank you, Simon and Schuster, for making this available. You can see the backyard here. Got the pool light on. I don't have the waterfall on, but I'm going to turn it on in a bit. Don't worry. And yeah, I'm having an Oliva 3. You can see. Yeah, I'll show you the camera. Okay. Yeah. Isn't that a pretty wrapper? The Oliva 3 and what do we got? Egan's. We got Egan's Irish whiskey. Just a sip, and it's like heavily watered down by now because I put some ice cubes in it. And it's August in SoCal, so it is warm, but it's not too warm. We're going to continue on here. Chris Caldwell says the Vietnam generation was not made up of malingerers, agnostics, or cynics. Can you guys hear that dog in the background? Oh, you maybe can. Okay. I got noise removal on, no dog. I can hear the dog. You're not going to be able to hear the dog. It's battlefield heroism from the 4-day clash at Ia Trang in 1965, which began when a battalion of the 7th Cavalry was dropped by helicopter into an ambush in a rainforest, to the infernal multi-week siege of Khe Sanh in the wake of the Tet Offensive in 1968. Matches anything in the annals of American combat. That heroism stuck in the popular imagination less than did the fraggings, the intentional maimings or killings of officers, and other incidents of undiscipline. Under these circumstances, one might have expected worse. Soldiers who had been told they were defending the freedom of the Vietnamese people arrived in country expecting to be loved and supported. They weren't. One infantry lieutenant who had interviewed villagers day after day for a year recalled, "I never once heard a Vietnamese say, 'Don't go down that trail, there's a mine.'" The sense of betrayal must have been unfathomable, but it dented the patriotism of the younger generation much less and much more selectively and slowly than later accounts would lead one to think. The top selling single of 1966, according to Billboard magazine, was neither "You Can't Hurry Love" by the Supremes, which came in at number 8, nor the Troggs' "Wild Thing," number 24, nor the Beach Boys' "Good Vibrations," number 33, nor anything by Simon and Garfunkel, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Bob Dylan. It was Barry Sandler's Marshall "Ballad of the Green Berets." See, this is why I like Chris Caldwell. He reminds us of stuff, man. He reminds us of stuff. Yeah, let's keep going. Of course, if you never knew in the first place, how could you be reminded? When in November of that year, Robert McNamara made a visit to Harvard and found his car surrounded by 100 protesting Students for a Democratic Society, SDS members, one dean wrote to convey our deeply felt apology for the discourteous and unruly confrontation forced upon you yesterday by members of the Harvard College community. A petition of apology quickly circulated among Harvard undergrads, too, and within 48 hours, more than half of them, 2,700, had signed it. In late 1968, after the Tet Offensive and the riots at Chicago's Democratic Convention, the war was opposed by a majority of those over 50, over 50, but supported by those younger. See, these are the kind of details that Chris Caldwell provides that makes him one of my favorite writers. I'm like, I didn't know that. Thank you, Chris, for saying that. But the leadership class that emerged out of the late 1960s was not a sociological cross section of the generation the way the leadership class that came out of World War II had been. It was highly atypical, and that was a contingency that would warp American society and politics in the half century that followed. Wow. Wow, Chris. Dude, you're throwing down, man. You're making me think, man. Yes, I have already read this, but I'm reading it again and again. For one thing, wow. It was heavily selected for non-participation in and even opposition to the war. It had been mostly the working class and the poor who had fought overseas, and mostly the university educated elites who had protested back home. Very insightful. Enrollment in higher education had given the latter an automatic deferment from military service for as long as they could afford to study. As long as they could afford to study. An exemption that the Johnson administration eventually curtailed. An outraged editorial in the Harvard Crimson 1968 called the end of such deferments a bit of careless expediency, clearly unfair to the students who would have filled the nation's graduate schools next year. They were protesting as much to keep themselves out of the war as to end it. Oh, that is really good quotation right there, Chris. That's really good. Chris, thank you for writing this. Mm, mm. Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. They were protesting as much to keep themselves out of the war as to end it. In a diary kept in 1966, the Harvard undergraduate Stephen Kellman recorded the misgivings of a friend who had said, quote, and this is a block quote, it's a longer one. I'm against the war, I guess, but I wouldn't want to fight in any war. My brother had a friend who tried to get it a 4F by eating a lot of sugar 2 days, excuse me, by eating a lot of sugar 2 days before he went in for his physical and not pissing. So they think he had diabetes. They gave him a 4F, but that afternoon he fell into a sugar coma and died. Jeez. I could try freaking out, coming in high on pot or doing the homo routine, but they put that kind of rejection on your record and that can screw you up for life, unquote. Page 76 at the top. Years later, Kelman's Harvard contemporary James Follows would recall traveling on a bus to the Boston Navy Yard with the draft eligible classmates who shouted pro Viet Cong chants and threw their urine samples into the face of orderlies. Wow, man, this is pissing me off, man. The Harvard students hoped that the undesirable character traits they manufactured, excuse me, manifested would keep them out of military service. Follows himself got a medical exemption by dieting down to 120 pounds. As they left, a bus arrived with more draftees, whom Follows described as boys from Chelsea. Thick, and this is a direct quote, boys from Chelsea, thick, dark haired young men, the white proles of Boston. Most of them were younger than us since they had just left high school, and it had clearly never occurred to them that there might be a way around the draft, unquote. In 1968, 135 students affiliated with the Students for a Democratic Society occupied Harvard University Hall. The Harvard professor of Irish literature, John Kelleher, a working class Irishman from Lawrence, Massachusetts, called them spoiled brats with an underdeveloped sense of history and a flair for self protection. That's a direct quote. The occupation was broken up by policemen from surrounding cities, many of whom had sons and brothers in Vietnam. Scenes like this were happening all over the country. At Columbia University, the SDS staged demonstrations against the buildings. Against the building of a gymnasium in nearby Harlem neighborhood. They morphed into larger protests against the Vietnam War and racial inequality, where police handled the kids roughly, too. Part of the brutality, wrote the historian Todd Gitlin, reflected a kind of class war SDS had not reckoned with. Working class cops' resentment of the children of privilege. As civil rights had divided the country by region into those who were heroically fighting for equality and those who could justify being assigned to receive moral instruction, Vietnam did the same by class. The defenders of peace and justice were disappropriate, uh, disappro- excuse me, disproportionately to be found at rich men's universities, and their innocence of military involvement would give them much more in common with those who came of age in the demilitarized decade or so that followed. The working class would wind up tainted by the popular culture's portrayal of the military as burners of villages and marauders in free fire zones. Who would hire such a person to run a corporate department? Who would elect such a person to Congress? Page 77 at the top. The same white proles of Boston follows described would be subjected to the most high-handed carrying out of federal law in the decade to follow. The court ordered desegregation of Boston public schools starting in 1974. The word desegregation belongs in quotations because most of the schools affected were within white, ethnic, mostly Irish American and Italian American neighborhoods. There had never been any black people there to segregate. The process involved two-way busing, transporting white students into, and I'm going to say so-called white, Chris, and so-called black, Chris, transporting so-called white students into poor and violent Boston neighborhoods and replacing them with bussed-in so-called black students. When the so-called whites of South Boston and Charleston protested, their neighborhoods were put under military occupation. Southie had been a curfew. Sorry, excuse me. Southie had a curfew and laws against public assembly enforced by 1,600 police officers, 100 federal marshals, and 50 FBI agents, and 600 National Guard troops. So-called whites made up 60% of the public school system on the eve of busing, less than 20% when it had finally done its work, little more than a decade later. Now, I'm going to interject here. If you don't know about busing, if you've never heard a critical take on busing, you need to look it up. You need to get into that. You need to put that on your radar. I'm just going to leave it there. Judge W. Arthur Garrity, a resident of the wealthy 100% so-called white suburb of Wellesley, and another of the court ruling that mandated busing, and sorry, excuse me, an author of the court ruling that mandated busing. Looks like I need to get this light closer to me. Excuse me. I'm about to put the waterfall on and just do a little cigar action. So he was an author of the court ruling that mandated busing, appointed a panel of distinguished experts to study the controversy, about whom William Bulger, for 17 years, the president of Massachusetts Senate, quipped, quote, they were distinguished, as far as I could see, only in the sense that not one of them was the parent of a child who would be affected by forced busing. Jeez. Ah, pisses me off, dude. Busing, forced busing. Relative to their fellow citizens, privileged Americans took out of the Vietnam era a sense of their own moral authority that was not battered but strangely enhanced. The moral basis for overthrowing the egalitarian order established by Franklin D. Roosevelt had been laid. Whether one praised that order as fair or assailed it as Procrustean, New Deal liberalism had been built on one size fits all rules, on uniformity. Page 78 at the top. The protests against Vietnam were a sign that the old mid-century rules were beginning to chafe. The novelist and late Senator James Webb later Senator James Webb, wrote shortly after the war that America had shown itself afraid to ask the men of Harvard to stand alongside the men of Harlem. Same uniform, same obligation, same country. Now, men who, as grade school students, had gasped when they learned that the Northern rich had been able to pay substitutes to fight and die for them in the Civil War were themselves seeking to carve out, in the middle of the so-called century of the common man, a niche that was worthy for elites to live in. I am convinced that when the history of these decades is written 150 years from now, the columnist and critic Irving Kristol wrote in 1979, there will be a chapter called The Aristocratic Impulse. In April 1969, a member of the Progressive Labor, a Maoist anti-war group at Harvard, wrote a soul-searching indictment of the more fashionable Students for a Democratic Society, accusing SDS of drifting toward elitism, but explaining that drift in terms of temptations common to the entire student left. Here's a block quote. On the one hand, we were angry about the war, about racism, about the countless vicious acts we saw around us, but on the other hand, we viewed America as one great wasteland, a big, monstrous, mechanized, air-conditioned desert, a place without roots or feeling. We saw the main problem, really, as the people, the ways they thought and acted toward each other. We imagined a great American desert populated by millions of similar crass beer drinking grains of sand living in a waste of identical suburban no places. What did this imagined great pig sty of what did this imagined great pigsty of TV watchers correspond to in real life? As middle class students, we learned that this was the working class, the racist, insensitive people, unquote. That's the end of that block quote. Back to Chris Caldwell on the bottom, page 78. Things already going on at the time of the Vietnam War inclined privileged people to look on average Americans as the country's problem. Page 79 at the top, the counterculture. And I'm going to turn the frickin'. It's time to get these waterfalls on. Original sound for musicians is on. We're going to turn the waterfall on, bud. Go out and get a copy of Chris Caldwell's Age of Entitlement. Get it and follow along. Follow along today. Don't delay. And by the way, support your local brick and mortar book dealer. Okay? All right. I'll be right back. I'm going to turn the waterfall on. All right, kids. Quit screwing around. All right, guys. We got some serious work to do here. The Counterculture, page 79 at the top. To many young Americans, the war was traumatic. Not because it violated notions of what their culture was, but because it conformed to them. It quite naturally produced a counterculture. In popularizing the term, the scholar Theodore Roszak, Roszak, claimed that the mental habits of technocratic management had created a mechanistic myth of objective consciousness, which numbed and cheapened human relations. It seemed to explain not just Vietnam, but a good deal more besides, from the sameness of suburbia to the insipidity of television. An important dimension was missing from American life. It seemed to be a religious or spiritual one. Perhaps Americans didn't think enough about their place in the universe. Perhaps they didn't love enough. I can see where this is going. All right. However much the generation of the 1960s and 70s may have been snickered at in later years for seeking spirituality and self-actualization in faddish programs like Hare Krishna, Esalen, Werner Erhard's Esther, young people were not wrong to believe their culture had lost its way. The problems they were so desperate to treat had been diagnosed by sober-minded institutions, too. At the Second Vatican Council between 1962 and 1965, the Catholic Church had tried to wrestle with its parishioners' role in a modern pluralistic world. The Harvard theologian Harvey Cox, C-O-X, in case you didn't know, argued that secularization need not mean the trivialization of religion. For decades, reinvigorating Western religion and philosophy with a dose of Asian spiritualism had been a favorite project of Western intellectuals. Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts, FSC, Northrop, the beat novelists, and poets. The generations that came of age in the 1960s and 1970s were, in this sense, religious. Until 1975, religion, measured by both professed belief and church attendance, had been falling off, but it then began a steep rise that would last 2 decades. The Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam classified the period as another in a series of what American historians called Great Awakenings. Fundamentalism and evangelical Christianity would shape American politics starting in 1976 with the election to the presidency of Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, himself a born-again Christian. It was a revival led by young people, not a remnant composed of a few geezers. Page 80 at the top. For a while, starting in 1963, when Timothy Leary was ejected from Harvard for his demonstrations of LSD, drugs were the spiritual solution with which that generation protesters were most closely identified. To arrive at the unknown by disordering all the senses, as the French poet Arthur Rimbaud put it, it was a cause on a par with making love, not war. People use drugs with particular ardor, not only about for only about 2 decades until around 1985, the government cracked down on them, and young people decided they were not a liberty worth defending. In the years after that, the stoner, faded out of the story of the 1960s like some reprobate who enlivens the early pages of a Gothic novel, but whom the author loses track of as the action picks up. Okay, I'm going to get rid of the background noise. So no more waterfall sounds. Let's continue. Maybe the problem with drugs was that they were an affront to one vital component of countercultural thinking, religious or not, the idea of purity. What a concept there, Chris. What a concept. Somewhere out there was the real America, unspoiled, unexposed to the influence of television and shopping, unmanipulated by politicians. Americans of the 60s and 70s sought out places where the 20th century had not done its awful work on the national character. The University of Minnesota professor Robin Pirsig worked throughout the 1960s on Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, 1974, which mixed a memoir of mental illness and a reflection on the Occidental philosophy with a picaresque account of a long motorcycle journey with his son. For Pirsig, to exit from the federal highway system onto smaller roads was to enter another world. Here's a block quote. These roads are truly different from the main ones. The whole pace of life and the personality of the people who live along them are different. They are not going anywhere. They're not too busy to be courteous. The here-ness and nowness of things is something they know all about. It's the others, the ones who moved to the cities years ago and lost offspring, who have all but forgotten it. Unquote. Page 81 at the top. Chris Caldwell continues. A certain cultural environmentalism was the natural accompaniment of this rural hankering. It was not the mix of science, ethics, and politics that we call environmentalism today, and which back then was only just emerging under the name of ecology. It was more a romantic way of life in the sense that William Wordsworth, nature never did betray the heart that loved her, was romantic. That's insightful. Uh, just take a look at Edward Abbey's books, especially his one called The Monkey Wrench Gang. They got guns. You know, speaking of guns, I think of Hunter S. Thompson in Big Sur shooting wild boars on the property he was on. It's not his property, but guns. You know, I don't think Joan Boaz liked guns, but he did. And I'm not like anyway, the Monterey County kind of stuff. Not exactly the environmentalism that you think of today. More REI than Bass Pro Shop. But let's continue. Um, yeah, Hunter S. Thompson would definitely be more Bass Pro Shop, is my point. And uh, anyway, so would Edward Abbey, I guess. With that main character guy, the gun guy, the guy that drove the Jeep. On the cover of the novel. Anyway, let's continue. Um, Now, drawing from Western culture's deep well of ideas about simplicity and authenticity, it was, while it lasted, something you could partake of even in a truck or on a motorcycle. It meant natural ingredients. Author and dietitian Ural Givens. Home cooking, Chef Alice Waters. Family values as defined in some past era, not just Happy Days and other 1950s nostalgia, but also the Waltons, a colossally successful 1970s television series about the Depression in Appalachia, almost never re-aired in the decades that followed. Really, I don't think I've seen the Waltons. Really, and that makes me want to watch that. Folk and country music, all kinds of crafts, macrame, latch hook rugs, Quaker furniture, the grumpy novels of Edward Abbey. Okay, there we go. Backpacking and the Whole Earth catalog. Okay, the Edward Abbey thing, I have it underlined, but I've just been thinking about him recently. I was required to read Edward Abbey in high school. What was his name? Hatfield? Mr. Hatfield? Geography teacher, 10th grade. Was it 10th grade? Did I take him in 10th grade? I ran into him again in 2012, I believe, in the lobby of Hampton Inn in Ken Carl in Colorado, Chatfield High School. Geography teacher. I don't think he remembered me, but I remembered him, and he looked pretty much the same. So good for you, Mr. Hatfield. All right, let's continue. Um, when the baby boom rock critic Greil Marcus described the band's eponymous second album, 1969, as a passport back to America, he meant it as a compliment. Turning back the clock was a shared societal yearning. This is very insightful. Something linked, say, the New York University psychology graduate who joined a commune in Oregon, thinking America had been better before superhighways, with the rural Georgia native who moved to Arizona and joined a megachurch, thinking that America had been better when women stayed home. This is very true. This is very insightful. It was not a specifically political yearning, but politics eventually would come into it. When people came to distrust modernity as a kind of corruption, it was not just the corporate world supermarkets and sitcoms and dandruff shampoos they resented. It was also Washington's dams and highways, regulations, and bureaucracy. Over time, it would be Johnson's Great Society, which expanded the welfare state to dreamed of and undesired levels. In certain lights, the 1960s counterculture looked like a reactionary movement disguised as a progressive one. Persig, for instance, may, page 82 at the top, have been anti-war, anti-corporate, drug-friendly, and steeped in academia, but he was no free spirit. What he liked about small-town America was its resemblance to the country of 100 or 200 years ago, and he defended political reactionaries out to restore individual worth. The mountain climber Guy Waterman had been a speechwriter for Presidents Eisenhower, Nixon, and Ford, not to mention General Electric, before retiring to an electricity-less cabin in Vermont to write about nature. That is very insightful, Chris. That's a very good connection of Republicans to this counterculture movement. I would also say the Jesus movement, which became Calvary Chapel, totally Republican, right? Everybody knows what I just said is correct. Yeah, it is correct. Illinois-born John McClary, who during the Reagan administration would begin calling for revivification of small-town government from his Vermont log cabin near the Canadian border, had himself worked as an aide to Reagan. An important strand of 1960s radicalism, the individualistic strand, would wind up fitting 1980s conservatism like a glove. And it's now Maha. You guys, the Maha movement fits this to a T. And they got Trump in there for the second term. And remember, Chris is writing this in 2020. Or, well, he published it. Simon Schuster published it, made it available in 2020. So he probably wrote it in 2019, maybe. I don't know. The next section is called The Sources of Baby Boom Power. And we're not going to get to that today because we've been going for about an hour. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Let's hear the waterfall. Doug has got this book on Dallas Willard, which is his mentor at USC, University of Spoiled Children, where he did his PhD in philosophy under Dallas. The author is, I think, named Moon, and the title is called Becoming Dallas Willard. I'm halfway through it. I've been reading it every time we house sit, and I'm about halfway through it now. Dude, I'm transfixed now. I feel like I want to do that book on the podcast. I may need to borrow it from Doug. Finish reading it at home and do it on the podcast. I don't know. I haven't talked to Doug about it yet, but Dallas went to, during the 60s, he was a PhD student at University of Wisconsin, Madison. Actually, wait. No, he got hired at SC in 1966, so he was already a professor when Vietnam was going on. But why did I think about Dallas Willard? What was it? I don't know. Something about the counterculture connection with small town America. Dallas was a product of small town America. And his common sense epistemology approach, common sense metaphysics, common sense morality, dude, if you don't know anything about this, you gotta get on board with this. Sources of baby boon power. Really wish I could finish this chapter today, but it goes to page 89. It's a bit out of our wheelhouse today. Well, anyway, thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. It's 13 August 2026 years after Jesus, and I'm enjoying this night in Orange County with this Oliva 3. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.